Good morning and welcome everyone to this webinar on financing adult learning. I think we might still welcome a few more participants. I can see people in the waiting room. We let them in as they come, but to not waste too much time at the beginning of this session, I would already start with the introduction. Perhaps I see one more person, and when this person is with us, yes, okay. Yeah, good morning, everyone. If you want, you can introduce yourselves in the chat, of course. Let us know your name and the organization, the country that you are from. Then we also have an overview of who is here today, the geographical scope of the webinar and the backgrounds, the organizations that you are working. Our webinar today takes place in the framework of the European project REGALE, which aims to strengthen regional capacity for adult learning and education. This project is coordinated by EAA and ERLAL. EAA, that's my organization, and ERLAL, that's the regional and local authorities for lifelong learning. This is the second webinar in our series of webinars, and the next one will be held at the end of January. More information will be coming soon, and you can always follow our social media and the project website for more information. I think my colleague Tina will also share the information in the chat. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Rafaela Kira. I'm head of policy at EAA, and I'll be your facilitator today. Our speaker today is Katharine Mullock, who is a labor market economist at the OECD. But before I hand over the microphone to Katharine, I'd ask you to just bear with me a little longer, because I'd actually like to also introduce a former project that EAA worked on in the area of financing adult learning. So yeah, we looked at that topic already a couple of years ago with our Erasmus Plus project Finale, Financing Adult Learning and Education. And I think that there are also some of the project partners from back then here in the participants list. A warm welcome also to you, and please you can start the discussion in the chat already with some questions that you might have. In the project, we did some research into the financing of adult learning. And what we found out back then, so the project ended in 2018, and what we found out back then is that between 0.1 and 0.2% of the GDP are public funding of ALE. If you look at the whole education sector, then funding is typically between 4 and 6% of the GDP in most European countries. So you can already see that adult learning only has a very small share of the education financing of the public one. But if we include private and employer side funding of adult learning, we get to between 0.6% and 1.1% of the GDP. And this also gives you an indication of how the funding of adult education is actually shared. There's a very small share of public funding, and then of course a much bigger share that comes through private funding. That means funding from individuals, but also employer side funding. And in the Finale project, we also looked at the return on investment, which is something that typically we don't do that much in adult learning because it's also difficult to find out. But still, we found some evidence in local areas that every euro spent on adult learning means saving 3 euros in public spending. So that would be a spending that doesn't need to be made in the health sector or police or unemployment benefits and so on. But as I said already, the benefits of adult learning are usually more long or midterm, sometimes even across generations. So therefore, it's very difficult to measure and to assign a concrete monetary value to adult learning. Still, from an adult or from an advocacy point of view, actually from an EAA perspective, it's very important for us to ask, what is the cost of non-investment in adult learning? We believe that this is a very strong message also to policymakers when we talk about sustainable and stable funding for adult education. What would happen if it's not financed anymore? And where would governments have to spend a lot more? Yeah, but we know that talking about money and financing can feel uncomfortable, sometimes also just because you have an Austrian background like me, where talking about money is usually frowned upon and not something that's done very publicly. But in adult education, we need to do that, even if we come from a grassroots perspective or a social and community aspect of learning. It's very central to our work, of course, and to adult education itself in many countries and regions. We only know of very few countries and regions in Europe that actually provide sustainable and stable funding for adult education. And when they do, it tends to be limited to certain types of adult education, and usually those that are work-related. When we look at how the funding of ALE actually breaks down, we find that ALE in Europe, I mean adult learning and education, not the ALE for drinking, it relies heavily on program funding, learner fees, and project funding. But as some of you probably also know quite well, this usually requires long application and reporting procedures, everything that's public funding generally, and learner fees, on the other hand, potentially exclude a large group of potential learners because they have lower purchase power. But okay, I leave this debate on the side. That's already another topic. And I'm now actually very curious to hear more about the work of the OECD on financing for adult learning from our speaker, Katharine Mullock. She's a labor market economist, as I said before, in the Directorate of Employment, Labor and Social Affairs at the OECD. And her work focuses on helping countries develop policies to adapt to changing skills needs arising from technological change, globalization, and aging population. She has also authored and co-authored various OECD reports on adult learning, skill assessment and anticipation, and career guidance for adults. Katharine, the floor is yours. Thank you. And I'd like to hand over to Katharine. I don't know how to unmute her.
Sorry about that. I think my Hi there. Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. It seemed like my connection disconnected for a second, but thank you so much, Rafaela, for presenting those results, which are fascinating. And I don't know, as a Canadian, I don't know if we're more or less comfortable talking about money than Austrians, but it seems that that's what I'll be doing today. And as Rafaela said, I'm a labor market economist in the Directorate for Employment, Labor and Social Affairs. And I think that this conversation is coming at a really opportune time. We're 2 years into this pandemic somehow. And I think over the last year, we've been hearing policymakers talk more and more about the upskilling and reskilling challenge. And a lot of people have lost their jobs through this pandemic. A lot of people have seen the nature of their jobs change quite a bit as the automation trend that we were seeing before the pandemic has seemed to accelerate a bit. And so at the same time that we have this major reskilling and upskilling challenge, public budgets are also tighter. So how do we fund upskilling and reskilling at a time when public budgets are tight? That's the big question. And today I'm hoping to maybe not answer that question, but to lay out some of the financial incentives that we've seen through our work at the OECD have been in common use across European and other OECD countries, and discuss a little bit their potential to promote co-financing of adult learning between the state, individuals, and employers. So I'm going to share my screen. And can you all see it okay? Great.
Yes, perfect.
So just to lay out the context a little bit, as you all know, a large share of jobs will likely be affected by automation. By OECD estimates, about 14% of jobs could be fully automated, and another 31% could see the nature of their task content change quite a bit as the work people are expected to do changes. Though some have suggested that this trend could lead to mass unemployment, the evidence we've seen from the last 20 years suggests that's not the case. In fact, employment rates have increased. But the picture is not all rosy. Over the same period, labor markets have become more polarized as adults or individuals with higher skills are more easily able to adapt to the changing demand for skills and to work alongside machines and technology because their skills complement the machines and technology, while middle skilled jobs have disappeared because they tend to be require more routinized tasks. Survey evidence suggests that 1 in 4 adults lack basic digital skills, which suggests a strong need to reskill in order to respond to these challenges. Yet, of course, many adults do not train. And we know from survey evidence that only 4 out of 10 adults trained in either formal or non-formal job-related training in the 5 years prior to this survey. And why don't they train more? Well, it depends, but it's adults who tend to need more training are the ones who train less, and that's older adults, low-skilled adults, those who are unemployed or low wage tend to train less than their counterparts. And the main reasons for them training less tend to be lack of time and cost. Here I'm showing a graph showing the share of adults who said that cost was the main barrier across countries. The lack of time is an even bigger barrier than cost. And that's lack of time because of both work responsibilities or family responsibilities. So any initiative to improve participation needs to consider those 2 main barriers to adult learning. Based on latest available estimates, which at this point are over 10 years old, so take it with a grain of salt, funding of adult learning is shared, as Raphael was saying, based on the Finale project as well, between employers, the state, and individuals. But it really tends to be, at least based on these estimates, the employer who's paying 45% of the cost, so they're the biggest contributor. And we know that since the time of these estimates, there was the financial crisis, and a lot of countries reduced their spending on adult learning even more. In Europe, the European Commission did step in to fill that hole, at least for some countries, like Portugal and Slovenia. A potential risk with that kind of project-based funding, though, is that it might not be as sustainable as more institutionalized types of funding schemes. So those are funding schemes that promote more co-financing between individuals, the state, and government. And the presentation I'm going to share with you today is going to be based on 2 OECD reports. The first is a review of individual learning accounts that looks at individual learning accounts in 7 different OECD countries and how they are designed, what take-up is like, and how quality is monitored. The second is a review of Australia's financial incentives for adult learning. So it started off by looking at the barriers to adult learning in Australia and how the existing set of financial incentives could be strengthened to promote more, like, broader and more inclusive participation. And it draws quite a bit from international examples of financial incentives. This is a simple taxonomy of financial incentives developed by a colleague at the OECD, and it really covers incentives for investing in more skills all the way from initial education all the way up to adult learning. And it's showing measures both on the supply and the demand side. The supply side being measures aimed at education and training institutions to either reduce the cost of training or to affect provision in some way. And on the demand side, measures aimed at individuals and employers to promote more investment by them and also to reduce the cost. And in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the demand side, and I'll look at 6 of the incentives that seem to be used quite a bit in Europe. But the starting point, of course, is what's the rationale for government intervention to be in this space? And I think when it comes to training, the government, the rationale tends to be that without government intervention, individuals and employers tend to underinvest in training, which means that society and the economy at large, we miss out on those positive externalities that come from training, things like increased productivity, increased knowledge spillovers, lower skills mismatch. Rafaela mentioned like lower crime potentially and better health outcomes. So I think they're also justified on the basis of distributional advantages. I showed earlier a chart showing that adults who maybe most need to train are the ones who train less. So depending on how the financial incentive is designed, this can get at targeting lower skilled or lower income individuals and to hopefully help them to train more. So all the financial incentives I'm going to be presenting today have the common objective of trying to reduce the cost of training to promote greater participation. But some of them also try to steer training towards skills in high demand. So skills in maybe the green economy or the ICT sector. So to promote skills that are going to yield those public benefits that we're hoping for, like higher productivity and lower skills mismatch. Some of them also try to promote job transitions between lower demand occupations or sectors to higher demand occupations or sectors, which is a particularly important objective today in the context of COVID-19, when there's some sectors that have completely crashed in terms of demand and others that are emerging. Some of them also try to encourage greater employer investment and responsibility for training, while others look at trying to promote greater individual investment and responsibility for training. And as I mentioned, depending on how they're designed, financial incentives can also be used to try to make training more inclusive. So I'll start with the individual learning accounts. They've received a lot of hype in recent years. And these are individual accounts in which training rights are accumulated over time. And resources are only mobilized at the moment that the individual actually enrolls in the training program. The reason that they've received a lot of renewed attention in recent years is their potential to promote portability of training rights. So from one employment status or a job to another. It's particularly important for non-standard workers who maybe don't have a strong link to a particular employer. It's a way for them to be able to finance training. And it's also really important for, it can also be helpful in promoting job transitions, because you don't need to ask your permission to of your employer to use the ILA. But ILAs are not a solution for every training challenge. And in particular, there's a quality control challenge, and evidence suggests that low educated individuals use these schemes quite a bit less than high skilled individuals. So evidence from the CPF in France suggests that managers and professional occupations are using the CPF 3 times more than workers in blue collar occupations. And that's even despite the fact that in France, the CPF allocates more training rights to low educated adults than it does to high educated adults. In Austria, they go a step further. So you can only use the individual learning account in Austria if you have less than a tertiary level education, or if you have a tertiary education, you can only use it if you fall into the low income category. And in Austria, they have actually, the inequality issue is less marked than in France. So that really emphasizes that the design of these programs is really important. If the issue is really, if the issue you're trying to address through financial incentives is really how to improve participation of low skilled adults, you're either gonna have to think about the design of the ILA or maybe consider an alternative like training vouchers and subsidies, because these are easier to target. Subsidies and training vouchers also promote co-financing from the individual most of the time. And the reason why they're easier to target than ILAs is that with an ILA, a person's socioeconomic status can change over time. And which means that their eligibility for particular training rights can also change. And that obviously that undermines the portability feature of the ILA. But with subsidies and vouchers, you can only have access to the subsidy or voucher if you meet the eligibility requirements at the time of enrollment. So it's easier to say, okay, this is going to be reserved for people who are low income, unemployed, because if their status changes next year, then they won't be eligible next year. Whereas with the ILA, it's harder to adapt because it's a lifetime account. Of course, a risk with using public money to subsidize training is that how do you ensure that the training is going to have a public benefit and not just be, something that supports an individual's leisure activities? So, for example, the classic case is how do we avoid individuals using these subsidies for their crocheting class? Crocheting gets a bad rap, but that tends to be the example that's used quite a bit. One approach is to restrict subsidies to training that is in high demand. So that's something they do in Estonia and Latvia. You can only use the vouchers for shortage occupation training. In Flanders, adults can only access training after they've spoken to a career guidance advisor, with the thought that the career guidance counselor will point them towards training that will increase their employability. Quality control is a big issue with subsidies and vouchers, just as it is with ILAs. The issue being that the subsidy goes directly to the provider. So there have been some abuses of these systems, particularly in Australia and the UK, where training providers were offering free iPads to students, potential students, for them to enroll so that they could get the subsidy, and then not actually offering the training. So really important to have quality control and stringent vetting of providers in order to prevent abuse of the system. Loans are another option, and these have the aim of reducing the liquidity constraints that adults have when it comes to training. So in England, for example, you can use the advanced learner loan to cover the cost of your training, and you only need to pay it back once you're earning above a certain income threshold. So it's got the advantage of it can easily target people who most need it. The risk is that it may deter people who are more debt averse to using the loan. Tax incentives for the individual can come as either tax deductions or tax credit. And what's really nice about the tax incentives is that you're using the existing tax infrastructure. So there's relatively little in the way of administration costs to get this financial incentive set up. One disadvantage is that it's difficult to target underrepresented groups using a tax incentive, primarily because if you're unemployed or you have very low income, then you'll have either a very low tax burden to begin with or none at all. So this incentive may not actually help you very much. And indeed, tax incentives tend to be used much more by high educated, high income adults than by low income, low wage adults. And in the Netherlands, that finding was enough to lead to a switch from a tax deduction to direct subsidies in order to facilitate better targeting. The other disadvantage with tax incentives is that most of the time they restrict the use of the tax incentive to the current occupation. It has to be relevant to your current job. So that avoids it being used for job transitions. There are some exceptions though. Both Germany and Austria allow the tax relief to be used for work that is related to training to prepare for a job change. And as I mentioned, while cost is a big barrier to training for many adults, an even bigger barrier is just not having the time because of work responsibilities and home responsibilities. So addressing the opportunity cost of adult learning is arguably more important than addressing the financial cost. And that's what the paid training leave, or even paid or unpaid training leave, is one way to get at this. And it's used in several OECD countries to address the opportunity cost issue. A drawback when it comes to training leave is that, again, it often requires having the employer permission to use the training leave. So you can't just, you have to justify to your employer that you're going off of work for something that's going to be useful to the employer. So again, it deters the use of training leave for job transitions. Again, there's some exceptions. In Flanders, the employer actually cannot refuse a training leave request. And similarly in France, if the employer can refuse, but only under certain conditions. The training leave, of course, may be burdensome to the firm, which is an issue. And this may be particularly the case for small and medium enterprises who, if you're one or two man down, may not actually be able to undertake their usual business activities. So job rotation schemes in Denmark, Finland, and Portugal address this issue by providing the employer with a temporary replacement while their regular employee is training. And usually these temporary replacements come from a pool of unemployed workers. And the final financial incentive that I'll present today is training levies. So these are generally employer training levies. And they are designed to overcome the free rider problem, which is that employers have a lower incentive to invest in training, because if they put all this money into investing in the skills of their employee and then their competitor comes by and poaches them, then they've just lost their investment. So the idea with the training levy is that employers in a given sector or a given region are required to pay a contribution into a common fund, and then they can request the use of those funds for training of their employees. And there's different ways to set up an employer levy, different designs. Generally, the contributions range from as low as 0.1% in certain sectors in Belgium to 2.5% in certain funds in the UK. Another advantage of the training levy is that they encourage greater employer responsibility. So arguably, if the employer is more involved, then they're going to make sure that the training is well aligned to labor market needs. So you get better quality training. The risk, of course, is that if employers are not engaged, they resent this being asked to contribute to this levy, they may see it as a tax, and they may, decide to only use it for training that covers what they would have been doing anyway, so like health and safety training. And we do see that that evidence that that's the case. One way to address that, or to have more employer engagement, is for the social partners to be involved in the management of the fund. So for example, in Italy, even though the employer levy was introduced by a national law, it's the social partners who manage the levy. Again, because it's going through the employer, there's this issue that training funded by an employer levy may not facilitate job transitions. And also that there's a distributional issue that SMEs may find the burden of these contributions to be greater than for large firms. So in the UK, SMEs are not required to contribute to the employer levy, and yet they are allowed to draw from it to subsidize training. So that's one way to get at the distributional issue. Now, I understood that there was interest in looking at examples of decentralized funding schemes. For the most part, the incentives that I've been talking about today are funded and managed at the national level, but there are some exceptions. In the United States, the individual training accounts are funded nationally by the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Fund, and yet it's the states who actually manage the ITAs. Similarly, in Australia, there's a national level funding for the Stronger Transitions Package program, and yet it's the regions who manage the training and the other support that's provided to displaced workers. And there's an example also from Flanders, where training vouchers are funded and managed at this subnational level. So I'm going to try to wrap up with some key lessons that we can take from these couple of reports on financial incentives in adult learning. I think it's really important from the outset to be clear about what the objectives are. What are the existing barriers to training in a given country? And what are you trying to address with the financial incentives that you're considering implementing, or the set of financial incentives that you're considering implementing? And to consider the entire training ecosystem too. Usually there already are some subsidies or financial incentives in place. So look at how a new financial incentive might interact with those existing ones. And if the challenge in your country is that there's a portability issue for non-standard workers, then yes, maybe an ILA is the way to go. But if it's more about how to boost participation for low-skilled adults, then maybe vouchers or subsidies are a better solution. And if you want to have more employer investment in training, maybe consider a training levy. And yet, if you want to have more, you want to promote more job transitions between sectors and occupations, then looking at the design of financial incentives and whether there's a way to avoid having to get the employer's permission to use them might be a way to promote more job transitions. So really need to be clear about those objectives. Financial support needs to be high enough to support real upskilling. What we've seen in the 7 ILAs that were covered in the report is that often funding is what's offered to individuals is so little that it's only enough to fund very short duration training courses. So it's usually like a couple €100 per year. So you'd have to wait many years to be able to fund a full reskilling initiative from like one occupation to another. It's also important to consider the distributive and sustainability implications of your financing method. For the most part, the more a funding scheme involves co-financing between individuals, state, and employers, the more sustainable it's going to be because it's sort of institutionalized that way. And yet, it also means that it might have inclusivity implications because the more that the individual has to pay, maybe for lower income, lower educated people, that could be a deterrent. Accompanying measures are needed to boost participation of the low skilled. We've seen this with the CPF in France. Just because you target a financial incentive at low skilled adults doesn't mean they're going to participate more. So additional measures are needed to either, through career guidance, reaching out to low skilled adults to boost their participation in these schemes, or looking at those other barriers, like looking at considering that the main barrier to training is time. Maybe you need to pair the subsidy or the ILA with a paid training leave in order to make them more effective. Keep governance and processes simple. Targeting reduces deadweight loss, but increases administrative burden. The more that individuals have to fill out paperwork to justify their eligibility for a given scheme, the more it's an administrative burden, which could be a deterrent to participation. And yet targeting is a way to reduce deadweight losses by making sure the subsidies go to people who need the support the most. Quality assurance is important to make sure that these schemes are not abused, and involving the social partners in the design of the financial incentive helps to improve employer buy-in while also making sure that training is well aligned with labor market needs. And finally, I mentioned at the start that public budgets are tight, and we want to make sure that this money has good value. If we're supporting adult learning, then it really does help to yield those public benefits that we expect it will. And to make sure that spending on adult learning yields good value, certain framework conditions need to be in place. If you have the perfect set of financial incentives, it's not going to yield value if the quality of training is poor. So a priority has to be promoting training quality, and there are several models emerging in Europe, varying broadly in complexity from quality labels and certificates to external quality audits and self-evaluations. We also need to provide to avoid duplicating efforts and making it really easy for adults to take time off work and reskill. So it's important that we recognize both informal and non-formal learning that may have been acquired through work experience. And the recognition of learning processes are available in many European countries, but take-up is very low and we're not entirely sure why. We also need to have an attractive and responsive training supply, meaning that training is offered flexibly. And so we've seen the use of online learning has shown a lot of potential over the course of the pandemic. Also, the modular training, which is certified by micro-credentials, is a big innovation that we should be pursuing more broadly in order to help adults train flexibly. And we need to help adults to make the right choices when it comes to training. Training that it should be aligned not only with the labor market, but also with their aspirations and their aptitudes. So career guidance for adults can be really helpful in this regard. And we're doing some work on this right now in our team. And we found that while career guidance for young people may not be that developed, career guidance for adults is even less developed in most countries. So looking at how to raise awareness about these about career guidance opportunities, and so that it can be an important, useful lever for directing adults towards training that is of high value. So I'm going to stop there. I hope I've provided some food for thought for today's discussion, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the financial incentives that you've had experience with in your country and what you've seen to be the advantages and disadvantages.